So this isn't going to last terribly long, but I hope it'll be okay. We'll see. And it's inspired by this, which I found in the Yale Free Press 10 years ago, roughly. Eve Tushnet. Anybody know of Eve? You know Eve?
No, I don't know.
Right. Well, she is an alternately Catholic and Jewish libertarian who reconverts routinely between these categories. But she was editor-in-chief of the Yale Free Press, which was a libertarian undergrad paper that was around and about New Haven in the 90s. And she was writing about a film called Gilda, which was made in 1946. And I'm going to talk about it today. And it'll be fascinating, even if you've never heard of it or seen it. Guaranteed fascinating. How many of you have seen Gilda, as a matter of interest? So a few. It's sort of a classic of Hollywood film noir. And I was interested that 53 years after this film was released, here was this young undergrad talking about Gilda, who is the eponymous heroine of the film, played by Rita Hayworth, and her ex-lover, then husband, then lover, Johnny Farrell, played by Glenn Ford. And the fact that she was able to extrapolate 5.5 decades further on from the movie to say that these ideas of dignity back through sex and dignity back through power were equivalent to some of the things that her fellow students were getting at. And so what I wanted to do was track through the history of this film, which I'd worked on for many years, and I did so with a former advisee of mine, Mariana Johnson, who's a Cuban American working on Cuban cinema mostly. And we were trying to locate this in the context of what we thought were some of the limiting factors in textual studies within film/media studies of a textual kind. Some of the implicit binary oppositions that were operant. And we created this list of good objects versus bad objects that appeared often without being made absolutely transparent, as it were, in a lot of the literature. So the way they've been paired by the nutty form in which this, for some reason, has transposed itself to the evil PowerPoint is that the pairs are next to one another rather than being in opposite tables. Is it better with the lights down? Yeah, thanks, Omar. Of course, I then won't be able to see a thing, but if I put my $38 pharmacy CVS glasses on, I probably can see something. Yeah, well, I go for nothing but the best. So anyway, the idea being that psychoanalysis is often deemed central. Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's great. Central to film studies, whereas other forms of the psi function, ego psychology, as it's sometimes called, are unsayable. Spectatorship is sexy, but the audience is unimportant, which is to say that the textually inscribed positions of understanding films in particular, but you could say the same about literature, are deemed to be worth knowing about and important, but empirical studies of audiences, who they are and how they handle information, are deemed unimportant. The archive is acceptable, so forms of historical research that go through old records are okay, but the laboratory is louche, i.e. experimental forms of investigation are not okay. Criticism is canonical, but ethnography is extraneous. The auteur is interesting, but the wonk is wearisome. Textual analysis is alpha, but content analysis is crude. Now, of course, if you were in communication studies, these would be reversed. Whoops, I've just spoilt the whole thing. Bit of a pity. Never mind, one does these things. So this was my concern, okay, that, or our concern, that things that were nostra, were donné, were kosher in literary studies and film studies were turned upside down when it came to communication studies, and we wanted to see whether it was necessary to have these things in such stark opposition. Of course, these are rather extreme oppositions that I've drawn. They're never as absolute as one makes them. They're heuristic devices when constructed like this for you to look at. So the idea is then to say, what would it be like if you took a classic film noir, a canonical text like Gilda, which has been the object of much elegant and sophisticated criticism, which I'll run through in a minute, but but thought that that criticism was rather monistic in its preoccupation, in its focus. What would it be like if we subjected it to a different kind of analysis? I might just put this down a little bit lower. Which incorporated a more materialist history of the film's meaning and life, a history that might reveal Gilda to be about spaces as much as psyches, and that understanding could emerge in the film's travels and its citations, as well as in its form and style. So if you like, it's that thing, that practice of following the life of the commodity sign, following the object, the biographical approach that Angie talked about. Here is the poster for the film. There Never Was a Woman Like Gilda. And there's Rita, who was perhaps most famous later in life for the fact that when she talked about her many ex-husbands and lovers, she said, "The trouble for me was men went to bed with Gilda and woke up with Rita." In other words, so iconic was this figure that she played in this her most famous role, that her private life, her sexuality became almost filled up with it, right? Whether it was the Aga Khan or Orson Welles among her many famous husbands. That this was in a sense both the making of her and the tragedy of her. And it's that blurring of the private and the public, of the woman and the star, that I'll touch on as we proceed. Not surprising, given its themes, which I'll get onto in a moment, it's conventionally understood academically as very much a sexual drama. And that means that, although that analysis is, in my opinion, correct, it's nevertheless been analysed in ways that pay insufficient heed, so Mariana and I argue, to history and location. So taken are its critics with sex, and that topic. The narrative backdrop to the film is that Balan Munson, this figure on the right, played by George Macready, runs a casino. It's set in the year that it's shot, 1946, in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And this casino provides money laundering services for a global tungsten cartel run by German Nazis who've escaped from denazification processes in Europe. Munson himself is described in the literature as an Hitlerian presence, his facial lesion, which you can't see too well here, suggesting an aristocratic German past, dueling scar. The casino and the cartel represent a return for fascists to international domination. And it's interesting that one of the speeches that Munson gives about his role in life is that he wants to be, and I quote, "a man who controls a strategic material, tungsten, because if you do that, you can control the world, and the world is made up of stupid little people." Munson repeatedly disappears from Buenos Aires and from the casino into the interior, a mysterious site, Latin American site, beyond urban norms, and he's always reluctant to celebrate the end of the war, even as everybody else is doing so. His two associates are central to the film, the new and much younger wife, Gilda, Rita Hayworth there, and a new and much younger personal non-digital assistant, Johnny Farrell, played by Glenn Ford, whom you see here with Rita Hayworth. There are numerous signs that Johnny, there on the left as you see it, and Munson, there on the right, do the bad thing together in off-screen space. There are uncharacteristically lengthy glances between the two and references to gay life. This shooting stick is referred to as their little friend. Ford, the Johnny Farrell actor, claimed that he and Macready, and I quote, "knew we were supposed to be playing homosexuals," unquote. And not surprisingly in that context and the many hints in the film, the noted scholar Richard Dyer imagines the text as caught between gayness, in no way portrayed positively, and sadomasochism. It also, though, seems probable, not surprisingly given the previous slide, that Johnny and Gilda used to do the bad thing as part of the backstory, used to do the bad thing, have sex together, before, in a sense, the film itself starts. And when you add this to the repeated efforts throughout the text of Gilda to elude the controlling paternosters and the physical constraints of these men, but also others, these signs have rightly fascinated feminist and queer critics. And indeed, the investment many of those critics have in psychoanalysis is encouraged, it's interpolated, it's repaid by the script's zealously obedient Freudianism. Gilda complains at one point, "I can never get a zipper to close. Maybe that stands for something." She taunts Johnny's closeness to Balan. Any psychiatrist would tell you thought associations are revealing. This walking stick, this ebony walking stick that I mentioned, he refers to, I think, 7 times as my little friend. And he insists to Johnny, when he hires Johnny, and I quote, "I must be sure that there is no woman anywhere." And Johnny tells him in response the famous line from the film, "I was born the night you met me." So for the likes of the film noir historian Frank Krutnik, Gilda is, and I quote, "the high watermark of 1940s erotic displacement." And it may well be that much-studied eroticism or its watermark is important, but there is also a geohistorical lineage beyond World War II and male-female male triangulation, a history and a future beyond the boundaries of the film and its Freudianism that I think could enrich our understanding. For example, Rita Hayworth, to get into her biography as a star, institutionally, embodied a new Hollywood aesthetic of difference, one at a price. Her real name was Margarita Carmen Dolores Cancino, and her parents were New York dancers, her father a Spanish Sephardim. After the family moved west, Margarita was dancing at 15 at the Agua Caliente, or hot water, jockey club, just north of the US-Mexican border, a favoured locale for gangsters and film producers. And she was transmogrified by a Hollywood mogul into Rita, then placed in several pictures as, in terms of how she was advertised, the dancing Latin. Her dark hair was dyed auburn, and she underwent 2, no doubt very painful years of electrolysis to raise her hairline from a supposedly Latina look to what were deemed Anglo norms. Columbia Pictures executive Harry Cohn, a notorious misogynist and serial sexual harasser, adopted her as his protege and introduced the woman who produced Gilda, Virginia Van Upp, to her and said, "You will make a starring vehicle for my girl." Hence Gilda. And now we see, I hope we're going to see and hear, her sultry torch singer sequence, if it ever comes up. See? Thank you. Thank you.
They had the earthquake in San Francisco back in 1906. They said that old Mother Nature was up to her old trick. That's the story that went around, but here's the real lowdown. Put the blame on Maine, boy. Put the blame on Maine. One night she started to shim and shake. That brought on a Frisco quake. So you can put the blame on Maine, boy. Put
Johnny's not enjoying this.
They once had a shooting up in the Klondike when they got Van McGrew. Folks were putting the blame on the lady known as Lou. That's the story that went around, but here's the real lowdown. Put the blame on Maine, boy. Put the blame on Maine. Maine did a dance called the Hitchy Coo. That's the thing that slew McGrew. Put the blame on Maine, boys. Put the blame on Maine.
Well, she was also part of the San Andreas Fault as well as the Chicago Fire. I'd forgotten that part. That sequence, the sultry torch singer stuff and other exotic style dancing, really made Hayworth her fame. There was a very significant ethnographic study of working class women in Chicago in the mid-50s into what Rita Hayworth signified to them, not something ever addressed by the psychoanalytic critics because it's grubby and material and positivistic, right? So what did she represent to these working class women? None of these psychoanalytic critics have ever cited any of this work or any of the other stuff I'm going to mention to you. Luxury and glamour, a dashing hero, more concerned with the now than with the future. these are quotations from these women, and also sexually available. She'd like a man that could give her anything she wants. She wants to show off Rita Hayworth. Well, with that sort of style and that circulation, it's no wonder that when an atomic bomb was tested in the Bikini Atoll, it was named Gilda and carried images of her. French T-shirts depicted her as La Vedette Atomique, the atomic scout, and she's still called that in much of the Francophone world, a sign of the kind of volcanic power associated with her semiosis in the film. Film studies tends to overlook Gilda's connections to the economic and the geopolitical as well, but references to these trends are abundant in the film itself, aptly understood by the Village Voice recently as the most prominent big business as underworld noir. Place is extremely consequential here. As I said, it's set mostly in Buenos Aires, to a certain extent in Uruguay, and Argentina is the most European in some ways of all non-European nations. At least that's what its constitution would like you to believe. And that's because of its population growth from 1880 to 1920, which drew principally on migration from Spain, Italy, Russia, and Central Europe. When added to immigrants from nearby Latin American countries, it also became the most urban part of the hemisphere, as rapid economic expansion between 1870 and 1930 ushered in a significant middle class and also infrastructural development. But the Depression eroded the country's export markets in wool, in grain, and beef, and the society was monumentally fractured. That led to 50 years of populist/authoritarian regimes/dictatorships and a concentration of wealth in elites. A coup in 1930 put the middle class, the military, and the traditional oligarchy in a very awkward but typically Argentine coalescence in power. And Argentina also became the centerpiece of Nazi espionage in Latin America, with a spy ring established there in the late 30s that also embarked on propaganda, assessing US cultural exports for what we might call cultural imperialism and recruiting fellow travelers. And it was because of the success of that the United States began its massive propaganda campaigns under FDR in Latin America. Successive unstable regimes followed until a further coup in 1943, still during the Second World War, led by fascist sympathizers, notably Juan Perón and his wife Eva, she of Evita, in which Madonna strips with her gloves as per Hayworth in Gilda. There's Madonna as the title character in the film from many decades later. It was only in 1944 that Argentina finally ended diplomatic relations with Germany and arrested some of its spies. By the time that Gilda was being made, the Perons dominated the political stage. In 1946, he became president, leading a bulky, awkward coalition of right and left-wing workerist populism cobbled together among the urban proletariat, the lower middle classes, and rural workers. Perón's decade in power saw the nation become a preferred haven for tens of thousands of Nazi war criminals and fellow travelers. These included the notorious SS medical researcher Joseph Mengele and Holocaust administrator Adolf Eichmann. Many departed Nazis went on to fruitful careers as advisors to right-wing dictatorships across Latin America. Many of them, of course, brought with them large sums of money, much of which was deposited in accounts under Eva Perón's control. And there were crucial links to Siemens, the German electronics multinational. Meanwhile, Argentina's application to join the United Nations, resisted by the Soviet Union because of the nation's late decision to turn against fascism, was railroaded through by, guess who, the United States, anxious to add to the list of client states that would give it a majority of votes in the new body. Then, as part of the emergent Cold War, the US government blended the occasional anti-fascist criticism of Perón, a consequence of his having a populist anti-US rhetoric, with a large-scale program of aid to ex-Nazis. Now, getting back to Johnny, the character played by Glenn Ford, his first line of dialogue in the film, this is a moment when the camera tilts slowly upwards to show the Gringo Street gamblers thrown dice. His first line is actually extra-diegetic narration. It's not something spoken in time to the people in front of him. It's spoken to us, omniscient male voice of narration. And it speaks to the attitude of the US towards Latin America from both ruling class and petit bourgeois levels. I quote, "To me, a dollar was a dollar in any language. I didn't know much about the local citizens." Obviously hadn't done intercultural communication studies. Later on, a couple of the Nazis dismiss him, and I quote, as the American Indian, unquote, who is meddling where he isn't welcome. And Johnny, in response to this, proudly avows that this is in fact his fate, that manifest destiny has gone global. He goes through a makeover during this time from a surly swindler to a glamorous gambler. And that makeover is achieved really quite blithely. He says at one point, by the way, about that time the war ended. Again, this is voiceover as a contextual counterpoint to the promise of transcendence implied in that earlier oath to his boss, Balan Munson, the casino owner, but I quoted, "I was born last night." His character is as distant from space and time as are his textual analysts. Munson's casino, where he goes to work, is a massive South American house of sin, as it was described in US reviews at the time. It's a sign of a fabulous, corrupt modernity, for all the world an engine room of pleasure and deceit. Its huge rooms whir with the sound and vision of spinning wheels, milling crowds, shimmering gowns, and dazzling lights. It represents the uneven modernity of Latin America as tradition and development overlap in both contradictory and compatible ways. Buenos Aires comes alive in Gilda as a bizarre amalgam of sordid street life, glittering wealth, and winding, perennially dark streets. Munson is like a James Bond villain. He has this perverse gaze on revelers from a concealed eyrie atop the casino, and he manipulates other conspirators. He's determined to achieve international as well as interpersonal conquest, and the setting for latter-day viewers calls up Bondian sequences of excess. We're more than halfway through. There's a moment when Johnny is trying to do some cross-cultural communication training for Gilda. He says to her, "You can't talk to men down here the way you would at home. They think you mean it." And at one moment, an Argentine gigolo is dancing on the floor of the casino with Gilda. He asks her, "Where did you learn to dance?" Her reply, "America." That's what she says to him, draws puzzlement. "This is not America?" he asks. And of course, the retort is perfect. The casual arrogance of appropriating the word America to stand for the US is problematized. She then goes on to use racial difference to inscribe sexual desire in her response. "I always say there's something about Latin men. For one thing, they can dance. For another thing," and then she smiles, says nothing more, she hands him her phone number. Now, this conversation goes on in Spanish, even though she's been told earlier on by Johnny how to comport herself with Latin men. Johnny, who can't speak Spanish, is excluded from the conversation, so he demands to know what was said. She deceives him, saying that he'd instructed the boy to hang up if a man answers. There is no translation for the audience, so most US viewers are in fact placed in the same position as Johnny. They must rely on the translation of a woman who is being set up as simultaneously unreliable and desirable, at least by his lights. But interestingly enough, her name signifies in Spain as word of honor. And one way of saying it's my word of honor in Spain in the 21st century is it's my Gilda. Now, this high tensile mix of eroticism, in my opinion, references a kind of hot Latinism mediated through this person who is, of course, painfully and painstakingly de-Latinized, the actress Rita Hayworth, as well as major world events. These things leave, it seems to me, a deep historical trace. And that's why, along with all the psychosexual things, La Jornada, which is the contemporary leftist Mexican newspaper, the place that's been the major funnel of information in many ways from the Zapatistas to the rest of the world, it includes a moment in the film when Johnny is violent to Gilda, he slaps her in the face, as one of its remarkable 50th anniversary events. Expansión, newspaper in Madrid, metaphorized technology stock declines in the first part of this century with reference to her. The magazine Urban Latino nominates Rita Hayworth and Che Guevara as amongst the 16 sexiest Latin historical figures. Why? Because of her part in this film. And if you remember the Madonna song Vogue, anybody old enough to remember Vogue? Well, you'll recall there's a line in that when Madonna sings or says, or whatever it is she's doing, Rita Hayworth gave good face. There's little doubt that she was alluding to this most famous of sexualized characters. Sympathique, the album, Pink Martin, right? Anybody know that album? She pays tribute as well to Gilda. Entertainment Weekly, a periodical that many of you have been reading, no doubt, while I've been talking, when I've been up here at different times online. In its list of the 100 greatest performances ignored by Oscar, Gilda, the performance by Hayworth, is number 21. And the American Film Institute, 4 years ago, listed amongst the 400 most memorable lines of cinema, the following from Hayworth: "If I'd been a ranch, they would have named me the Bar Nothing." So I want to suggest that all of this cultural intertextuality and much more that I'm going to talk to you about is crucial to any evaluation of its meaning. There's a movie from the 60s called Down to Earth, which brings back the cane that George Macready wields, and George Macready, and Rita Hayworth to dance. And in The Lady from Shanghai, the Orson Welles masterpiece that she stars in from a couple of years later, there's a promotional intertext from Gilda, all the way from the use of male voiceover and the triangulation of desire, sometimes Girard is right, through to the setting and the music. People will remember the great neo-realist classic The Bicycle Thief. The bicycle thief sees the protagonist making his way around town, putting up sections of a film poster. What's the film? It's Gilda, affirming both his nation's poverty at the same time as he indexes his obligation to accept Yankee culture as part of the Marshall Plan. One of the preconditions of the Marshall Plan in Italy was that 2,000 Hollywood films that had been sequestered away during the Second World War would be immediately released onto screens. And then a fantastic TV series from the 60s, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. George Macready reprised his role 20 years later in one of the episodes as a leftover escapee Nazi living in Central America, whose plans for global domination are coloured by the intense delight he takes in the sadism of his junior underlings. Some of you will remember a classic liberal moment of more or less contemporary Hollywood, The Shawshank Redemption, right? Tim Robbins, etc. Well, it's based, as some of you will know, on a Stephen King short story, which is entitled, anybody know? Thank you very much. And Tim Robbins' tunnel excavation from unjust and brutal imprisonment is secreted behind a classic Gilda poster. Moulin Rouge, Nicole Kidman's role in that, is basically an homage to Gilda, and as were characters from André Engel's latter-day version of Igor Stravinsky's Rake's Progress, and if you've seen David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, the references are manifold and manifest. But it's not only in these cute film references that the intertexts matter. 10 years ago, there was a yellow item worn by Hayworth in the film. It fetched 20,000 francs at auction, and this led to headline news. Her black satin strapless evening dress that you saw her in became perhaps the most famous of all Hollywood garments, complete with interior harness, gros gras beneath the bust, 3 stays, and plastic bars softened with a gas flame and placed around the top, thus defying the tendency of such items to fall. Saks Fifth Avenue offered a short version of the gown named as such in 2001, and that was the year when what was called the Gilda look became au courant in London via a heavy, pale pancake foundation applied with a sponge and lashings of pale powder. Then definition thanks to mascara and eyebrow pencil, blue-red lipstick with a brush, and Vaseline for gloss. The hair relied on Titian reds and golden chestnuts, I'm told, plus medium rollers, topped off by being set with either tea or beer. If you went to Naomi Campbell's Saint-Tropez birthday party during the 2004 Cannes Festival, the Gilda look, I didn't, but the Gilda look was de rigueur. And that same year, the Edinburgh Evening News, afternoon newspaper, could imagine nothing better to enliven Hogmanay. New Year's Eve, what would you do? You would dress up as Gilda. Every now and then there'll be a rumour in the international fashion world that the little black dress is going out of style. Very quickly there'll be rearguard actions led by people in the name of this film. Based on the certainty, and this is one of the taglines, Gilda will make men's jaws drop from shock and awe, I quote. And if you look at Garnier's summer 2005 cosmetics line, it was headed by a British Big Brother presenter made up to resemble Gilda. Watching the film was even recommended as a means of prompting and restoring the joys of flamenco dancing to a shell-shocked US after 11 September 2001. It continued to fascinate the Valencia Smart Set, and it invigorated costumes for Comédie Française Molière revivals and 2005-06 Parisian Prêt-à-Porter ready-to-wear. Rita Hayworth died from Alzheimer's. The US Alzheimer's Foundation raises money by selling a Gilda doll, and a couple of years ago, the Alzheimer Foundation New Year's Ball had people dressed up as Gilda lookalikes who stalked the room, recalling, if you like, at one moment both her finest hour and her later illness. No wonder that the film director Ridley Scott, Alien, etc., Ridley Scott, looking back 40 years to his childhood memories of the movie, said, and I quote, "That's why I fell in love with Rita Hayworth. Those were the days when you could sit and watch the film twice, and I refused to leave. It was quite an adult movie. Or in the words of Sharon Stone, sometimes I think she got Alzheimer's because she so desperately wanted to forget being Gilda. For Spanish people, if you lived under the Franco regime, you never saw the put the blame on Mame sequence that we just did. That semi-striptease performance was a newish sensation from the 70s because Franco-era censors cut the original beyond recognition, and even when the rest of it was shown, it was picketed by the Catholic Church throughout the country. Well, it seems to me that this life after the text, if you like, is available to a nimble materialist history, but it seems to have been unavailable to all the academic critics that I've found, and there are about 30 of them, who've written about it. Both the geopolitical setting of US foreign and cultural policy and the latter career of that text elude most critics. I think we can do better, and the point about this being in some sense some kind of exemplification, it was meant to be, instantiation of how you can do textual and political economic analysis, is that it doesn't mean, I think, jettisoning texts. It means borrowing from the extraordinary reading skills that are available, particularly for a canonical film like this, but pluralizing and complicating them, understanding texts as moments that spin their own tales of travel and uptake, as essentially unstable entities that change their composition as they move across time and space. Thanks, that's it. So thank you for your patience, and if you haven't seen the film, it really is fabulous. I wonder if anybody who has seen the film would like to add or subtract anything to what I had to say. No? Well, anybody got any questions or issues? Oh, sorry, fire away.
I haven't seen the movie, but I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm not feeling that well, so I apologize if I can't articulate it.
Dear, okay.
But I guess I'm just curious. Like, I thought, and I think that you've already probably answered this question in the way that you approached it. But I think I'm interested. I think Rita Hayworth and like Dolores Del Rio and Carmen Miranda have also had a long history of appropriation by Chicana and even Latin American feminist authors in the 20th century. So, like, I'm thinking of Cristina Peri Rossi, who lives in Barcelona, who was active in the Tupamaro Revolution in Uruguay, and Ana Castillo, and they both try to reappropriate. They both make fun of commodification of these artists and try and reappropriate them in certain ways. And so, I guess I don't know if that falls into the psychoanalytic kind of. Because a lot of them focus on sexuality as well. But they also are focusing or trying to deal with, I think, appropriation of, and the way that, of Latino labor, I guess, right? And the way that then gets represented in Hollywood. So I guess I was just curious about that, like other kinds of representations and appropriations that have happened afterwards that aren't just Hollywood.
Sure. No, and there are plenty of them, and especially of Carmen Miranda, obviously, because of her complicated career, and the way in which, like Hayworth, but over a longer period and more publicly, her life was remade under the sign of a particular spectacle, a fantasy. No question about that. But I haven't, whereas I've done similar research on Marilyn Monroe, and I found a lot of, I could have given that actually, but it goes on for a lot longer. I found lots and lots of Latin American and Spanish novelists picking up on her image in just that way. So yes, that definitely happens. I wasn't aware of it happening in the case of Gilda so much. But a comment about the psychoanalytic parts of it. One of the things that's very complex for Freudian critics in dealing with film noir is that very large numbers of people who were producers, writers, directors, and actors in Hollywood in the 30s and 40s were in analysis. You know, Freud was brought out to be the master dramaturg for Hollywood. So there's no question, this text is straightforwardly encoded as psychoanalytic. It's the same with any Hitchcock text. I mean, you'd have to be as blind as a bat to think that the Hitchcockian texts are not Freudian. They are. It's as straightforward as that. The problem that it seems to me sets for psychoanalytic critics is that they are meant to be doing a counter-indicative depth hermeneutic reading. But a counterindicative depth hermeneutic reading would be precisely not psychoanalytic because it's all encoded overtly. It's there in front of you. It's what you're meant to think. In the same way that if you're watching a Nicholas Roeg film, you have to understand Jungianism, or you're not going to have much of an understanding what the director's trying to say. But if you don't want just to be going for an auteurist reading, then in a sense, how about trying some other techniques? And that, I think, is very complex compared to the notion that Freudian struggles for the getting of sexual subjectivity are secret, unknown, universal narrative structures. You know, when they're something you've just paid for the week before on the Upper West Side or on the, in downtown LA, it's become something different, I think. And that's what's so interesting for me about Hitchcock, and what's so interesting as well about films like this, because it's absolutely true. You know, they are constantly referring to the idea of the unconscious, to phallic imagery, to what we might think of as logocentrically interdependent queerness being necessary as a means apparently of distinguishing the straight from the gay. You know, it's there. That's one of the reasons why I at least think it's useful to focus on what appears suddenly to be the blind spots of people who themselves say they are reading these things in ways that everybody else is blind to. Namely, this is in a place and a time that is extremely poignant and pregnant with meaning for the story, and that if you track the life of the film, you see that there are some fascinating elements that, sure, one, I suppose, could read psychoanalytically, but they also they provide the raw material for thinking about what happens when a sign is disarticulated from its referent, when something moves from being part of discourse in its originary context to being an ideal type. You know, when somebody who's never been to the United States listens to a band sing a song about Highway 61, they don't know what a highway is, they don't know what Highway 61 is, but they disarticulate the sign from its referent to derive some sort of pleasure from it. Or they go and find out what Highway 61 is, right? And you can think of all sorts of spatially specific films or songs, that, especially songs though, that get redisposed by listeners by that act of disarticulation. And then the act of rearticulation is particularly interesting. The one you were just citing, or the ones you were just citing with Carmen Miranda, etc., again, very poignant, I think, meaning.
Kind of spinning off that idea of rearticulation, I just wanted to mention that Manuel Puig has a novel entitled La Traición de Rita Hayworth. And he often, or in a couple of his books at least, writes about how Latin American men and women take the images from US or movies from other cultures and reuse them or recycle them or re-articulate them. So
yeah, and Kiss of a Spider Woman has a significant connection in the movie as well. I mean, in the film version of it. Yeah. Right.
Well, in the book version as well.
Yeah. For people who've not read
Boquitas Pintadas.
Pardon?
Boquitas Pintadas. As well.
Thank you.
La Traición de Rita Hayworth is betrayed by Rita Hayworth, and Toto, the main protagonist, is a film. It's a little kid who's growing up and loves films and is deriving most of his life from seeing films. Anyway, I found two things fascinating, Toby. One is how convincing the exercise is in showing the blind spot of a disciplinary reading, and how by following the semiotic and social afterlife of a sign, you can talk about the relevance of that sign for different contexts and for different populations or different communities of interpretation. The way in which people will be reappropriating and reading in particular ways this. But in some sense, so to me it perfectly illustrates what you wanted to illustrate partly, which is that a text cannot be read within its limits, as if its limits were somehow frozen in time, because what is distinctive of texts is that they will mean something different for different communities as things change. So that while the text may while it often doesn't, but may remain the same, everything else around it changes, and thus the semiosis that is produced changes. So that is illustrated perfectly in your example. What I don't think is illustrated so perfectly is that you are putting together a textual reading of the text and a political analysis of the film. Because a political analysis of the film would have read something like, okay, well, this is a 1946 film. This is the particular historical context. This was produced by the following studio. It was produced by the following studio under the following conditions. The other movies that were released at the time were these. The director's background was this and that. The actors that participated or not were paid this or that, were union or non-union. Well, you can imagine this much better than I can imagine that. So I wanted to ask you about this latter part. The first part is clearly granted and very well illustrated. It's this marriage of the textual reading, and which mostly you do not do. You refer to these disciplinary readings that are being all psychoanalytically centered and are paradoxically blind to these other things that later populations or moments in the history of this this text life will be represented. What would be the marriage of a textual reading and a political economy reading of this film?
Well, in terms of a broader one than I was attempting, and I was focusing very much on Rita Hayworth as the star sign, and I rather than that, though that is what I was also trying to do, I guess, but I was really focused on her. One of the things that one would do, apart from mentioning, as I did, who the producer was, who the director was, and why this film was constructed in order to create a vehicle for Hayworth in the context of her protege relationship to Harry Cohn, would be to explain what film noir is. And of course, many people refute the idea that it's a genre and reject formalist accounts of it. In fact, one of the things one would do would be to, if not resolve, at least account for the debate that goes on between political economic and psychoanalytic accounts of the genre, if for the moment we allow that it's a genre. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these debates, but on one side, the psychoanalytic, the notion is this is about the ending of the Second World War / the end of a Second World War, fractured, broken men returning to the United States, impotent, incompetent, incapable, far from the greatest generation that CBS and NBC news anchors of the 90s made so much money from celebrating, that the women who receive these returning soldiers are themselves suddenly removed from being competent and rendered also incompetent because they're taken away from the responsibilities and jobs that they've had. Sexual relationships foul and fail, and there are both weak and duplicitous men and powerful scheming women at the heart of everyday life. And this incapacity to lead a straightforward existence is explained narratively, but also shadowed figuratively via the use of chiaroscuro lighting and so on, the way that noir looks. That this is, in a sense, the forerunner to the other great psychoanalytic genre of post-war Hollywood, which is the classical melodrama of the 50s in particular. Again, looking in this case at the supposedly happy post-war white picket suburban white family that is itself internally wrought. Versus the political economic approach, it says, no, that's not really what it's about. The reason that it has these lighting circumstances is that Hollywood was operating on a 24-hour-a-day work cycle, and the idea was to have, remember this is still the days of permanent employment, Fordist-style organizations of studios, a 24/7 production cycle, and you wanted to have very few people and very little electricity being used in order to make movies at night. So that meant that you would have a different kind of lighting for B movies, which most of these were, from the lighting that you had during the day and the number of employees you had during the day to make your A movies. That there's an argument about conditions of existence. And this argument is played out famously in a debate. On the one side, Paul Schrader, the noted film director who has a PhD in film history, of course, and scriptwriter, who runs the psychoanalytic version, and Paul Kerr, who runs the political economic version, in that very brief moment of film studies in the early 80s, when an Althusserian formulation took hold in a way that wasn't theoreticist, but was articulated around technological developments. And the noted Italian theorists Scomoli and Narboni were part of this. So there's that kind of issue that you would raise about the conditions of possibility of film noir, right? I think that would be particularly salient, along with those questions you raise, such as the story origins and so forth. And then, obviously, if you want to do a materialist kind of analysis, you actually must do some kind of formalism, not the exclusionary and exclusive formalism that David was troubled by this morning or early this afternoon, but rather a formalism that says, in order to understand what these things are, at some level we need to understand their morphology, what's actually in them. Did Plato say this, or did he say something else? But again, one would need, in that context, to be very careful about what were the formal material properties. I mentioned the fact that the Put the Blame on Mame scene was censored in Franco's Spain. Well, if you take a film like Olympia, which was mentioned earlier in the seminar, the Leni Riefenstahl film, there were 10 versions of Olympia released around the world by the Germans, and the one that was released in the United States in the late 1930s just didn't have all the Nazism. They were released in different countries with different emphases. There's much more Jesse Owens in the 1936 US Olympia than there is in the 1936 German Olympia. If you think about the Mar and Par Kettle films, kind of C-grade, two-reelers from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there are hundreds of these things. Who knows what the originals were like in terms of what they were meant to mean, what their original audiences took them to mean, and so forth. And this is spectacularly true with the different circumstances under which one can deduce what were even just the formal properties of such texts. In my book, The Avengers, about a TV series that was popular in the 60s, still plays around the world, is a full-scale book-length attempt to do this for a TV series, much of which is lost, almost all of which is cut beyond reconstruction in terms of maybe a third of its episodes. But in trying to do a combination of its industrial history and its formal properties, one is forever confounded by the fact that you're not quite certain you're actually seeing what it was. So there's always going to be that gap that's hard to close. So there would be those sorts of moves that will be necessary. But as I say, certainly a focus on formalism, because it's a very rich text to analyze. There are lots of very interesting both stylistic and thematic maneuvers that are worth talking about, some of which are profoundly political in that they engage the political economic history that I mentioned, some of them profoundly political because of the gender relations and to a certain extent the race relations that I briefly touched on. So I take your point, I think it's well made, and I think I should have introduced it more as a focus on the star sign Rita Hayworth qua Gilda in the film and elsewhere, contra what I see as a more static universalist reading. I think there and then, oh sorry, no, there. So that one should go to Ramon, that one after Nicole should go to Vartan, I think.
Hello.
Yeah, you're on.
Right.
It's the confusion of the red ribbon. My mistake, the red ribbon. I couldn't tuck it in properly.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciated that paper and found it really thought-provoking. I was kind of curious, and I don't really know exactly how to put this, but your paper was a lot about the social afterlife of, a sign after it's been, as you said, kind of disarticulated from its discourse. I'm curious, though, how you could further expand some of this work by thinking about the film as being preceded by the sign, preceded by the image, because this poster, this image of Gilda is so enigmatic, right? That to a certain extent, you spend a lot of the time watching this film. Lots of films function this way, waiting for that scene, like waiting for that image to appear or whatever. And so it kind of precedes the discourse in kind of interesting ways. And I've thought a lot about this in terms of setting the scene for, desire and scenes and, psychoanalysis, blah, blah, blah. But I'm curious how you would start to tackle that question from more of a, political economist.
So do you mean, for instance, that not long after the film's come out, people who haven't seen it know about Put the Blame on Me, and they've seen the poster.
You've seen the poster.
So
yeah.
that's sort of that's the big moment.
Yeah.
So you've all heard that Robert De Niro says, "Are you talking to me?" And
yeah,
so
rather than saying, there's this
Yeah.
discourse, the film, and then I'm going to
Yeah.
take this image out
Yeah.
and, read back, and what happens when, I think the discourse is itself kind of set up through this image. This image, you wait as a spectator to see this image. And I can think about that in some ways. I'm curious, how
Yeah.
you might extend some of your thoughts.
No, that's an interesting one. I mean, whereas there is a literature on things like film posters, certainly, but it tends to be iconographic in function, and tends not to talk very much about what this then sets up for spectators. That said, of course, there's a major advertising literature that does effect studies that claims to know, however spuriously, what sorts of posters and other promotional paratexts will work in a certain context. You have the same thing with merchandising, where particularly in the post-70s period, many toys, shirts and so on precede a film by months, often into stores, so that children, and sometimes not only children, I bought the Emma Peel sunglasses when the Avengers movie came out, which was released for approximately 45 hours before someone saw it and slashed it to ribbons. Those things come out and they also provide horizons of expectation, absolutely, particularly when they're toys that you can inhabit and use, or in our case today, when you can actually have trailers, so-called, released online, where they're not just static, you can actually occupy some of the subject positions of the trailers and make them different, right? I'm sure some of you are familiar with that. So I think there are three ways one could go, it seems to me. One is simply to look at the raft of merchandising and promotional material for particular texts in different territories and see how they function, what they highlight. I mean, for instance, DVD and video rentals, when such things were important, often had different slicks or front covers based on the territory they were in, sometimes to do with nation, often to do with class, sometimes to do with race. Do you turn something into a David Bowie starring film, or do you turn it into a science fiction film? Depends where you're trying to get it rented. So you would do a bit of that. You certainly look, when this is possible, and often it is after the fact, at the advertising agencies that were used to promote these things, and see what they said they were doing, but also see whether they got hired again the next time and the time after, and what their track record is. And that's always a sensible, helpful approach, I think. And the other thing that you would do, particularly if you're preoccupied with star issues, is look at the regression analysis, if available, on the star's career. A lot of film studies is preoccupied with the idea that stars are crucial to the success of particularly Hollywood films, and that one of the things that other national film industries seek to do is construct star systems. This is not just a preoccupation of cinema studies or film studies, it's a preoccupation of the other media, which constantly tell us that it's true. It's a preoccupation of other promotional materials, which emphasize this. It's a preoccupation of the studios. Well, it's largely not true. There are lots of regression analyses that allow you to control for genre, studio, producer, director, writer, star, and will tell you, is a star bankable? And basically, stars aren't bankable very much at all. And it's instead a complex of all those other factors that explains when films succeed. You need a number of those things to be in series, as it were, in order for success to be attained. No matter how much this evidence is made available, and it's been available and keeps being proven again and again to be true over almost 30 years, no one pays the slightest, pardon me as I spit at the front row, attention, least of all people in film studies who are dedicated to careers built around writing about stardom, because it doesn't fit the notion. So you would also want to do, I think, that sort of work in order to say X was a great star of the time, when in fact what it might be, in the case of Rita Hayworth, a couple of movies, one of which has monumental textual resonance that you need to focus on, rather than make the claim that she was in a Hollywood elite. Because when you look at her career, like most people's careers, if you go through them, there are one or two high spots and then really not very much else. So those would be some of the things I think I would endeavour to do. But it's a lot of work and often rather frustrating and thankless. But often you get nuggets that are incredibly exciting along the way.
Thank you, Toby. I was just wondering what although psychoanalysis seems to be very well established at universities in terms of film studies, certainly in Australia, it doesn't seem to be where the action is in terms of studies coming out, book publishing journals and stuff. I don't see so many kind of articles using that approach anymore. And I was just wondering whether what your thoughts about some of the other kind of tendencies that are coming out in cinema studies at the moment, especially the kind of turn towards the transnational as a kind of way of thinking about it, global film studies and so forth, and what the kind of weaknesses or strengths of those approaches are. And I was also curious about to what extent the reading you did of Gilda, and the reading that the kind of sub-discipline of film history kind of does. I was wondering whether this was an argument for film history, or whether you're proposing something slightly different.
Right, well, on the first score, I think I was considering this when David was talking about the George Mason English department, because one of the tendencies in opposition to psychoanalysis, and in a very nasty way often, is so-called cognitive film theory, or so-called analytic film theory, which is a straight white male thing, especially in the United States and Britain, but available obviously to anybody anywhere. And this is an attempt to utilize the insights of cognitive psychology based on experimentation to explain how people make sense of screen texts. It's done always with attacks on feminism and multiculturalism, and specifically ideology critique / psychoanalysis. And it's based on a form of rational actor who is meant to be at the heart of the film spectatorship experience, who derives pleasure from picking up narrative cues. And it claims that there is no politics in film, there is simply the experience of looking at what's on the screen, or there's no politics in any text, there's a pleasure or the experience of picking up what's on the screen or in some other medium, understanding what's happening in terms of the drives given to you by the producers of this text through cues that say, this must be a joke because somebody laughed, for example, right? These people don't do any experiments themselves. They extrapolate, as I said, from experiments undertaken on other topics by other people, and then use this to buttress arguments that are essentially formalist / rational actor models of how stories are told and are allegedly universally interpreted. That is one alternative. And like psychoanalysis, it tends to have a universalist subject that is presumed. This time not in the text as well as outside the text, but just outside the text. So there's that. There is, as you say, the film historical model. My difficulty with the film history people is that they often have gee whiz accounts of, say, theatrical histories that are meant to be engagements with theories of modernity, but they haven't read much theorization of modernity, so they find things that suit them and draw on those. And I don't think they've done very thorough, renderings of the totality, although of course there's been some interesting work along the way. Those of you familiar with US film history will be aware that there's a particular fetish of early cinema, which is meant to be the moment when you understand the coming of modernity and the emergence of the modern metropolis. And the claims made I find extravagant and hard to prove. And the arguments over whether there were 701 working class people at the vaudeville or 703 do not fascinate me in quite the way that the price of Naomi Campbell's little black dress is. So I think I have a difficulty with that. In terms of the transnational model, I think that remains to be seen. There's a lot to be done. My worry is that often the renderings that we get under that moniker do not focus a great deal of attention on the travel of texts, the question of their distribution, their mobility. We were talking about Jeff Himpley's work the other day, looking at the distribution of Hollywood in La Paz in Bolivia, the way in which films from the United States start off in wealthy parts of the city. This is in the period of film, right, in the 90s, as extremely high-quality prints shown in well-appointed exhibitionary sites at reasonably high costs. As they make their way through the value chain downwards, as it were, to poorer people, the print quality gets worse, the exhibitionary facilities decline, the price goes down, and the experience is radically different. And this is an interesting way textually of modelling the actual nature of the economy of a city. That, I think, is a fascinating contribution, and you can see something similar with some of the work done on understanding the geography of Chicago in terms of its history of movie theatre exhibition. So I think that's where there's a lot of promise. Never at the cost, it seems to me, of knowing what the sights and sounds of the film are, right? But similarly, never at the cost of neglecting those distributional poetics, if you like, and also questions of reception and recirculation, redistribution, because of course, Hartley was right yesterday when he talked about completing the cycle. The Shannon model of sender message receiver shouldn't be a linear teleological one. Instead, it should be more of a circular one. I mean, feedback from working class Bolivian viewers is not important to Hollywood, but feedback from Iowan viewers of all classes is. So there is a loop that matters to these people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a quick comment and question. I think you probably pointed out, as many of us noticed, the self-containment of psychoanalytical, film studies and semiotics into sort of semiotics of culture. But I was wondering about, just your thoughts about getting away from structural semiotics altogether into different sort of patterns of analysis outside of science and representation. So that was just my sort of question, if you could give it a take.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to essentially just introduce the word creativity again, because I think that the point that was being made that I just wanted to terminologically pin to the wall was that that there's forms of creativity that are not author-centered, which seems to be the majority, but not all, of what we've talked about thus far in the 2 weeks, and just with one extra little observation, that at least from in my experience in the journals that I read and whatnot, in English, that is, this textual analysis in that mode and sort of reception theory and even moving into sort of reader response areas is kind of frowned upon. So it just seems, from a student standpoint, it seems sometimes difficult to write those sorts of papers.
A reader response paper, you mean?
Well, not a reader response paper, but I mean like a reception study, for instance. Even though, for instance, Steve Mayu here does that sort of thing, but it seems like it's a rarity from where I was.
I wanted to know if you could say a little bit about what you're seeing is, or what you're doing in kind of incorporating aspects of a material study of political economy to, like, the area that I'm coming from, I think, where non-Western or non-Hollywood texts are often read in the model of national allegory, even though that term is sort of, critiqued from a lot of places. I think that what often happens is that the cultural significance of a particular film is made to stand in for for the kind of social situation of the place it's coming from. And I don't think that these studies are necessarily doing a materialist kind of study, but for whatever reason are being attributed this kind of force of representing. And I know national allegory is also kind of formal model, formal term. So I thought that what was most rich about this presentation was that the way that we could see kind of the blind spots in earlier readings sort of really drove home the point that texts do change, and their meanings are not fixed. But in cases where there isn't that kind of film history, or there isn't this kind of historical record of earlier readings, and the kind of reading proposed is this straightforward national allegory, I was wondering if you had any suggestions. So.
Yeah, just very quickly, one of the things about the national allegory model is that in a sense it's a very traditional critical model, i.e. I'm going to take a text, you think you know what it means, I know it doesn't, I'm going to show you that it means something different, and in the case of that particular model, all texts coming from subaltern societies, so-called, must in fact evidence these tendencies, and I know because I'm a well-schooled critic. That kind of narcissography doesn't appeal much to me. I've never really liked it, and I think it's a classic instantiation of the ethos of ethical incompleteness with which I began 2 weeks ago, the Hegelian idea of reconstructing ethical substance that the ideal critic can manage. If you want to see a debate about this, then critical inquiry in the last year or so has a long exchange between Ian Hunter and Frederick Jameson about that kind of work. And I'm much more interested in interpretations that emerge from other people than from myself. So once they're there, they become information for me in interesting ways. And that you can actually have that happen quite soon, quite early. Is this reverberating too much? You can actually have that happen quite early in a film's career. It means at one level you have to work harder, at another level not as hard as with an old film. In terms of what you were saying, running through quickly, one way to justify doing that kind of work, if it interests you, is obviously to reference Steve Mayhew's work, but also there's a new journal called Reception that's just coming out that Phil Goldstein edits, and he and Jim Machaw have a new book out they've edited on, it's called something like Reception Study in America, and they're trying to look at literature, at film, at television, both at a thematic and syncretic level, but also with individual exemplars. And they also try to engage, as does Jan Radway in a very interesting essay in their book, with some of the reasons why what appeared to be sexy in the early 80s fell down the drain. In the same way that deconstruction fell down the drain, reception study fell down the drain. Why did that happen? Is it necessary? What was lost? Could it be remanaged? And how? And so I think one way, if you're having difficulty getting legitimacy either with journals or with professors or colleagues, would be to do a metacritical analysis and just indicate these things exist, they're options, here are the struggles they've gone through, let's see what happens if you run them another time. Who knows what would happen if our friends in analytic philosophy actually sat down and read philosophy. Vartan, I didn't fully understand what you were looking for in your comment. Maybe you're a better person to answer it than I am, actually. I don't mean that facetiously. I mean it seriously.
I'm just the idea that how can we do away with the idea of semiotic analysis, which seems to me to sort of reiterate some discourse, regardless of the ways in which we look at it, either formally or contextually. I mean, what was interesting about this question is the ways in which there's a mirror image in the sort of semiotics of even cultural film. I was wondering if we could sort of bracket that and look at different approaches away from the semiotics.
Yeah. I guess I still think that when you are looking at the formal and stylistic properties of movies, a combination of Soviet formalism or Russian formalism, depending on how you want to construe it, and semiotics can be incredibly helpful, just at the level of finding means of parsing what you see and hear. That said, I find it painstakingly boring to do myself and to read, I must admit, and I therefore tend to skate rather quickly into other directions because I'm more concerned with social theoretical issues. And if you look at the fate of the Metzian paradigm, the grand syntagma of semiotic film theory as outlined by Christian Metz in his work, nobody does it. A few French and Italians with too much time on their hands do, but virtually nobody else does. We all learn what it is, and we say, yes, we like semiotics, and we do talk in symbolic terms, but the level of detail required, I think, has been, in a sense, transcended. So let's see whether it can come back and whether it's worth it. I've really spoken for long enough. I think I should hand over the baton and run away.
I'm going to end things, at least here, to be continued elsewhere. First by thanking Toby once more. For his unending energy across these 2 weeks, and good cheer, but for one moment, for which he's forgiven. I'm going to end just by saying one thing, and then just read a kind of statement that wasn't prepared for this, but I'll contextualize it in just a minute. The first is that a number of people, and Sahana quite explicitly earlier today mentioned passion, a passion for a subject or a subject matter or a practice. And if there ain't passion, you might as well not be doing it, not least in this line of business, right? So if you don't have, if you're choosing an area to work in, if you don't have passion for it, don't even get going, right? Because you probably aren't going to see yourself through it in much of any way. And somehow it's got to grab you. I know that's sort of banal and cliched in a certain sort of way, but banality and cliche sometimes has a ring of truth to it, and this is one of those cases. Okay, so just to end off with a kind of return to theory. I mentioned earlier today the difficulty that some folks were having in where to go with, or where to take, or where to be taken by critical theory. Whether or not there's been a demise, its passion and energy seem to have dissipated somewhat. If I might put it in those terms. And a number of us here have struck here, not just at HRI, but on this campus, which after all was a principal site for the emergence and elaboration of critical theory over 25 plus years, have struggled in the name of the Critical Theory Institute to sort of find, that different people are doing different things in the name of critical theory, none of which seem to be speaking to each other. At least within this sort of institutional apparatus. People might be passionate about the narrow, whether it's transnational studies or whether it's, critical feminisms or whether it's critical race theory or whether it's critical theory or whether it's political theology and so on. People are out doing different things, right? And not much of it was speaking to each other. And a couple of us have come up with a manifesto as a response, right? As a way of seeing ourselves forward in the name of what Akbar Abbas cleverly denominated poor theory, right? So this is a manifesto or notes towards a manifesto regarding poor theory. So poor theory proposes to find ways, it's not very long, so we'll be done by 6. Poor theory proposes to find ways of making the most of limited resources. In that sense, it's less a theory than a way of proceeding. You can see how one is trying to open up sort of spaces in a perceived closing down. Poor theory then crucially suggests the need to work around intransigent problems when clear solutions are not discernible and the means at our disposal are limited, increasingly so. The poor then in poor theory suggests a kind of discomfort, not so much with theory as with its indiscriminate and undiscriminating use. It is not an endorsement of bad or sloppy theorizing, nor is it an all too easy condemnation of the poverty of theory, the poverty of philosophy or something like that. Right? Poor theory proceeds then not through a tabula rasa, by wiping the state clean and starting afresh. That, to an extent, was the modernist aspiration, which has proven to be always costly and often, to say the least, undesirable. By contrast, poor theory proceeds through appropriations and improvisations, through descriptions that do not leave what it describes unchanged. It is more a matter then of descriptions than of thick descriptions. Its procedures have something in common with bricolage and détournement, but with a difference. In the era of information and electronic technologies, bricolage necessarily becomes arbitrage. As economic arbitrage exploits price differentials in stocks and other financial instruments for profit, so cultural arbitrage uses imbalances and unevenness in global culture for its own ends or to its own purposes. Putting difference to good use, recognizing merit in what is generally considered meretricious, turning compost into compositions. These are some of the strategies of poor theorizing. Poor theory then must be distinguished from another of other positions which seem to resemble, like weak thought, Vatamo, architecture of the poor Hassan Fatih, or poor theory Grotowski, poor theater Grotowski, or art povera, Salant and others. So there's an elaboration of that. I'll pass over the distinctions. Poor theory then is theory shaped by the fact that we're always confronted by objects and situations, as Benjamin puts it, riddled with error, and that outpace theory. Accordingly, poor theory puts a stress neither on knowledge nor on ignorance, but on finding a relationship to what we do not know. It takes seriously the possibility that fascination can be turned into a critical method. So these notes on poor theory, of course, can be developed in many different ways, and that's the very point, right? I mean, there's an attempt to constitute a kind of openness, a disposition of openness sort of in this way, rather than a closing down. And we fully expect that it would be elaborated even amongst ourselves in different ways, leading to different collaborative projects to emerge out of poor theory's engagement with heterogeneous promptings, fragmentary thinking. I mean, there's a real connection to the very, very, very long tradition of the fragment, right, rather than the complete theory in some sense. I mean, going back, of course, to Heraclitus, right? And open-endedness, and its resistance to closure, totalization, and restriction. And on that, hopefully, opening note, I bid you farewell. Thank you very much.